We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are talking the Golden Dome, income tax, and a whole lot more. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And here we are on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're having a conversation with Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, tough times for the European Union at the moment with tariffs, right?
Yeah, so heading into the Memorial Day weekend, President Trump out of nowhere went on Truth Social and said, I'm going to impose a 50% tariff on the European Union as of June 1st. And then 2 days later, out of nowhere on Truth Social, he says, yeah, we're going to suspend it until July 9th. And so that's where the state of trade negotiations are. And whether or not it's going to succeed, doubtful.
Yes. So when you say whether or not they're going to succeed, what does success look like?
That's an excellent question, because it's all about, for the administration, yes, tariffs as well, the 30%, let's say 25% tariffs on automobiles. But if you comb through the National Trade Estimate report that was released prior to Liberation Day by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, there's a long list of the non-monetary trade barriers.
Yep.
Chemical regulations, licensing, currency strategies, all these different things that the administration, dislikes. You're telling me that these things which have compounded for a decade since the formation of the European Union is suddenly going to be dismantled by July 9th within a month? I highly doubt that that's going to occur.
Well, so that's the thing, right? Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she said that they're going to be working swiftly to come to some kind of deal. And that's when Trump put out that we're going to hold off on the 50% until July 9th. But what does that deal look like for the EU? Because the whole purpose of the EU was this single trading market of member states in which the EU's claim being that we will reduce regulation and barriers for trade between the member state nations. In reality, it was a regulatory overload in just every form, but it's a protectionist situation. That's the entire purpose of the EU, is protectionism for its member states, for the individual markets within the member states. So to get a deal, as you rightly point out, it's nothing to do with just the exports outside of the union or the economic zone. It's also about the non-tariff burden that exists. Now, how can the EU continue to exist as what it is if they are getting rid of these for like what we might call a favored nation deal with America?
Okay. So a couple of things. So I think it was on the day of the announcement, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he appeared on Fox News and he was talking about the European Union. And he made an interesting point that you somewhat alluded to. He said that the member states have no clue what the European Union leadership is doing at all. They're in the dark. They don't know what strategy they're employing. So I thought that was a very interesting point to make. Now, the second part too, when it comes to a trade agreement with the European Union, I tend to believe that the UK-US trade agreement that was announced a couple of weeks ago, that is the blueprint of what all these future trade agreements are going to be, which amounts to very little. You look at these trade deals this trade deal with the UK, and all it is rearranging chairs on the boat deck. That's all it is doing. So I suspect that the European Union is going to be the same thing, where they may trim around the edges. The United States is going to trim around the edges, and then President Trump is going to declare a victory and say, "Hey, look, we got a better trade agreement out of this." When in the aggregate, nothing much gains for the broader U.S. economy. Now, some industries may benefit slightly, like U.S. agricultural and its beef exports, that may benefit. But as a whole, there's not going to be much substantial change as you expected on that Liberation Day announcement.
Well, actually, I think you have it both right and a little bit wrong. And
No,
I'm not an economist, of course, but I do know the EU. I've studied the EU. I've studied what it does, and what it does is it protects key industries. So now, because the individual markets within the now 27 member states, each of those has big players within the market. So, for example, think champagne from France, think automobiles from Germany, and they have these key drivers. Now, the governments of these nations have to answer to the big markets within their country. And so what happens is the EU says that we're going to help these markets because that's going to be good for the governments. They're trying to get some cooperation from the member states. So the existing government of the time fully backs the EU project, which almost all of them do. We saw it with the Brexit vote of 2016. You had both the British Labour Party and the British Conservative Party both wanting to stay in the EU. And then, of course, just Nigel Farage pushing to get us out. And he was ultimately successful. But what happens is you have, for example, the champagne producers. The EU stamps down on all the other member nations calling any kind of sparkling wine a champagne. And they say, look what we've done for the champagne farmers of France, right? And if it's not from that region, you can't call it champagne. And they say that's a regulatory win. But then, of course, they also take the money that's provided to them through these member state governments, and they dole it out to various industries. So winemakers in France get subsidies from plumbers in South London, right? Working class plumbers in South London are paying subsidies to keep wine farmers on the go in France. And so what you have is, just to round this out to my final point, is you have all these markets, and that's what it's about. It's about individual markets within the member states, each getting a little bit of something. But what Trump, I believe, is aiming for with his tariff deal with the EU is access to the protected markets. So the ring-fence markets, he wants to be able to put into those and have U.S. suppliers of products afforded the same protections that other companies within the EU would have. And I don't think that's beyond reach.
Well, I would see. I'll make one point though. The United States does not have a champagne industry, so that point would not.
Especially according to the EU regulations, right?
I would see another point too. We talked this one on your radio show. A key thing that the administration does not like is a value-added tax. Now, the value-added tax, from my understanding and from my research on it, is a major revenue driver for the bloc nations. I think it accounts for about 20% of the overall aggregate for revenues. That is not something I believe that the European Union is going to suddenly dismantle and say, okay, we're not going to rely on, we're not going to suddenly, not generate revenues from the value added taxes, considering the fiscal strain that a lot of these governments have. So this circles back to my point, how it's all fine. You talk about champagne, you talk about winemakers. There's still trimming around the edges. It's not going to be a transformational trade agreement that the U.S. and the EU are going to lead to. And just on the logistics alone. So the administration claims that 200 countries have reached out to the administration to reach trade agreements. You need an immense amount of manpower to negotiate these trade agreements. And they all keep saying that it's going to happen soon. These announcements are going to happen, shortly. The only announcement we have so far is the United Kingdom, and it's been 2 months when that whole Liberation Day announcement occurred. So you talk about these subsidies, fine, but they're not going to be removed. They're not going to be abolished. They're going to say we're gonna lower the tariff rate by a minuscule percentage on this product, and then Trump's gonna call it a win, and then the market's gonna cheer, and then they're gonna say, "Okay, fine, this didn't amount to much at all." So now we know what the future trade agreements are gonna look like with India or with China or with Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein is not in the EU, but it'll have to be a bespoke one. But
Or the Penguin Islands, whichever island that they got there.
The Falklands, as I call it, and we'll continue to call it despite Argentina's protests.
When the Liberation Day announcement happened, I fell for it. I thought, okay, yeah, he's really going to upend global trade. He's really going to impose all these massive tariffs on these countries. He's gonna pummel them into submission. But a week later, when they reversed, and you had Kevin Hassett say, he's a National Economic Council director, and he said, yeah, the bond yields really encouraged us to, make a premature announcement that they were backpedaling. But my whole conclusion out of this is that the administration did not understand, did not expect the market's reaction of, stocks nosediving and the treasury yield soaring.
We're going to continue this conversation after the short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.